Here's a fun fact about galactic civilization. When you get enough species together who all think they're the smartest beings in the universe, they inevitably create something monumentally stupid to prove it. Enter the Galactic Apex simulation, the Hegemony Council's masterpiece of bureaucratic over-engineering, designed by committee and perfected by creatures who confused impossible with impressively complex. The Apex simulation wasn't just a test, it was a monument to overthinking. Built over the span of 2 decades by the finest military minds from across the galaxy, it represented the ultimate tactical challenge. Multi-dimensional warfare scenarios, real-time political negotiations with 15 different species, resource management across 12 star systems, and combat situations that would make seasoned generals weep into their morning stimulants. The thing was so complex, it required quantum processors just to keep track of all the variables. And here's the kicker. Nobody had ever beaten it. Not in the 38 years since its inception. Oh, they'd tried. Believe me. The Hegemony's best strategic minds, brilliant Zephyrian mathematicians who could calculate hyperspace jumps in their heads, Corvan battle masters with centuries of experience, even those insufferably logical Nexari, who treated warfare like a chess game played with actual lives. Thousands of attempts across 212 species, and the best anyone had managed was reaching 63% completion before the simulation chewed them up and spat them out like yesterday's ration packs. The failure rate was so consistent, so utterly predictable, that the simulation had become less of a test and more of a ritual humiliation. Species would send their brightest military minds to attempt it, not because they expected success, but because failing to try would be seen as weakness. It was cosmic politics at its most ridiculous, a game where everyone knew the rules, everyone knew they'd lose, but everyone had to play anyway. Which brings us, naturally, to the humans. Ah, humans. The galactic community's favorite punching bag, the species everyone loved to underestimate. They'd been part of the Hegemony for barely 50 years, and in that time, they'd managed to be simultaneously impressive and disappointing in the most human way possible. Sure, they'd won a few battles through sheer bloody-minded determination, but strategy? Tactics? The finer arts of warfare? Please. They were the equivalent of that friend who somehow wins at poker despite not knowing the rules. Pure luck disguised as competence. So, when Commander Brooke Holland's name appeared on the Apex simulation roster, the reaction was, well, let's call it mixed. The polite term would be skeptical curiosity. The accurate term would be barely contained laughter. Holland herself was hardly what you'd call an obvious choice for galactic military glory. Her service record read like a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving humans too much independence. Former cargo hauler, former smuggler, though that part was technically classified, and current pilot of supply runs between backwater colonies that nobody else wanted to visit. She'd been court-martialed twice, demoted once, and had a reputation for treating military protocols like suggestions rather than orders. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean cosmically absurd. Holland wasn't even supposed to be there. The whole thing started, as the best disasters often do, with paperwork. Some bureaucratic mix-up in the Terran Military Command had resulted in her name being submitted for the next Apex simulation cycle. By the time anyone noticed the error, the Hegemony Council had already processed the application, scheduled the attempt, and sent out the standard diplomatic notifications. Withdrawing would require explanations, and explanations would require admitting that humanity's military command was run by people who couldn't properly fill out forms. So they let it stand. The betting pools opened within hours of the announcement. The odds against Holland completing even 20% of the simulation started at 50 to 1 and quickly climbed to 100 to 1 as more details about her background emerged. The Corvin gambling syndicates were practically printing money, taking bets from species across the galaxy who wanted to wager on exactly how spectacularly the human would fail. "She'll last maybe 10 minutes, snickered General Thexari of the Corvin Strategic Command during a pre-simulation briefing. Humans have this charming tendency to overthink simple problems and underthink complex ones. This simulation requires the kind of multi-layered strategic thinking that their brains simply aren't evolved for." The Nexari representative, Ambassador Quindel, was more diplomatic, but equally dismissive. "We must admire humanity's courage in attempting this challenge. While we anticipate an unsuccessful outcome, the experience will surely provide valuable data about human cognitive limitations under extreme tactical pressure." Even Holland's own people weren't exactly brimming with confidence. General Marcus Kane, her commanding officer, and the poor soul responsible for explaining this mess to his superiors, had taken to consuming alarming quantities of coffee and muttering about early retirement. "Look," Kane had told her during their final briefing, "nobody expects you to actually complete this thing. Just try not to embarrass the entire human race, okay? Maybe last long enough to make it look like we belong in the same room as these other species?" Holland had nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the profound strategic implications of not humiliating her entire species. "Sure thing, boss. I'll try to fail with dignity." The simulation chamber itself was a monument to technological overkill. Holographic displays stretched from floor to ceiling, quantum processors hummed with barely contained computational power, and the air practically crackled with the energy required to maintain such a complex virtual environment. It could simulate entire galactic conflicts in real time, complete with political ramifications, economic consequences, and the kind of butterfly effect chaos that made lesser computers burst into flames. As Holland entered the chamber for her scheduled attempt, the gallery was packed with observers from across the galaxy. Military attachés, diplomatic representatives, simulation technicians, and more than a few beings who'd traveled considerable distances just to witness what they assumed would be another entertaining failure. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like. After all, watching humans attempt things beyond their capabilities had become something of a galactic pastime. Holland herself seemed remarkably unbothered by the attention. She strolled into the chamber like she was heading to the mess hall for lunch, hands in her pockets, occasionally nodding to observers in the gallery. Her uniform was regulation, but barely, wrinkled enough to suggest she'd slept in it, boots scuffed from years of actual work rather than parade ground posturing. "Quite the audience," she commented to the simulation technician, a nervous Zephyrian who'd been briefed extensively on human unpredictability. "Yes, Commander," the technician replied carefully. "Many are interested in observing humanity's approach to the challenge." Holland glanced up at the gallery, where several hundred beings were settling in to watch the show. "Huh. Hope I don't disappoint them." The technician's translator struggled with the phrase, unsure whether Holland meant she hoped to succeed or hoped to fail in an entertaining manner. Given humanity's reputation for linguistic ambiguity, either interpretation seemed equally likely. As the final pre-simulation checks were completed, the chamber fell silent except for the hum of quantum processors spinning up to full capacity. This was it, the moment when another human would attempt the impossible, fail spectacularly, and provide yet more evidence of their species' charming limitations. In the gallery, Ambassador Velthari of the Hegemony Council leaned forward with anticipation. They'd been present for dozens of these attempts over the years, and while the specific details varied, the outcome was always the same. Confident beings entering the chamber, growing confusion as the simulation's complexity became apparent, desperate attempts to salvage something from the chaos, and finally, the inevitable admission of defeat. "Simulation parameters loaded," announced the lead technician. "All systems nominal. Commander Holland, are you ready to begin?" Holland cracked her knuckles, a distinctly human gesture that made several observers in the gallery exchange amused glances, and nodded toward the control booth. "Fire it up," she said simply. The galactic apex. Simulation initialized with the subtle fanfare of reality bending to accommodate impossibility. Holographic displays materialized around Holland, showing star maps, fleet positions, resource allocations, and political webs of staggering complexity. The kind of scenario that would make experienced admirals reach for strong liquor and stronger antacids. In the gallery, beings settled back to watch another human learn exactly why some challenges were beyond their species' capabilities. The betting pools had closed, the odds finalized, and the expectations set. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, expected what happened next. Now, about our protagonist. Commander Brooke Holland wasn't exactly what you'd call officer material by traditional standards. Her file read like someone had taken a standard military career and fed it through a blender operated by a sugar-high toddler. Born on New Brisbane, a colony world so backwater it didn't even have proper hyperspace beacons until she was 16, Holland had spent her early years learning to fly anything that would stay airborne long enough to get from point A to point B without exploding. Her path to the military had been unconventional. Before joining the Terran Defense Corps, she'd spent 8 years running cargo between frontier colonies, which was the polite way of saying she'd smuggled everything from medical supplies to luxury goods past various blockades and customs inspections. The woman could thread a freighter through an asteroid field while half asleep and calculate hyperspace jumps using mental math that would stump a navigation computer. But here's where Holland's story gets really interesting. She was terrible at being a proper soldier. Court-martialed twice for creative interpretation of direct orders, demoted from major to commander after an incident involving unauthorized reconnaissance of a Corvan military installation, and currently assigned to the least glamorous job in the fleet, hauling supplies to colonies so remote they had to send smoke signals to request toilet paper. General Marcus Kane, Holland's long-suffering commanding officer, had developed a nervous tic whenever her name appeared in his morning briefings. A career officer who'd climbed the ranks through careful adherence to protocol and strategic brown-nosing, Kane represented everything Holland wasn't: politically savvy, diplomatically minded, and possessed of a healthy respect for proper procedure. "How," Kane had asked his aide that morning, staring at the notification from Hegemony Command, "did her name end up on the Apex simulation roster?" Lieutenant Torres, a young officer who'd made the mistake of being competent enough to handle Kane's paperwork, cleared his throat nervously. "Well, sir, there appears to have been a clerical error in the automated selection process. The system was supposed to pull names from the Strategic Command eligible list, but instead, it grabbed someone from the cargo pilot roster," Kane finished, rubbing his temples. "Of course it did, because the universe has a sense of humor, and that sense of humor is apparently trying to end my career." The news had spread through diplomatic channels with the speed and accuracy of gossip at a family reunion. Within hours, every major species in the hegemony knew that humanity was sending a washed-up cargo pilot to attempt their most challenging military simulation. The reactions ranged from polite bewilderment to outright mockery. Ambassador Velthari of the Hegemony Council had requested a private meeting with Kane to discuss what they diplomatically termed concerns about humanity's commitment to the simulation's prestige. Velthari belonged to the Altarian species, tall, elegant beings who communicated through a combination of spoken language and color-changing chromatophores in their skin. Currently, their neck display was showing the Altarian equivalent of barely contained irritation. General Kane, Velthari had said, their chromatophores shifting to diplomatic yellow, surely you understand the significance of the Apex simulation. It represents the pinnacle of tactical achievement in our civilization. To send someone so unqualified might be interpreted as a lack of respect for the institution. Kane had nodded gravely while internally calculating how many years he had left until retirement. Ambassador, I assure you that Commander Holland, despite her unconventional background, represents humanity's commitment to meeting our obligations within the hegemony structure, which was diplomatic speak for, we're stuck with her, and I'm just hoping she doesn't set anything on fire. Meanwhile, Overlord Kethvox, the Nexari strategist who'd designed the Apex simulation, was having his own crisis of confidence. Kethvox had spent 15 years of his considerable lifespan creating what he considered the perfect tactical challenge, a simulation so comprehensive, so elegantly complex, that only the finest military minds in the galaxy could hope to understand its nuances, let alone complete it. The Nexari were a species that treated logic like a religion and efficiency like a sacred duty. They'd been the ones to propose the Apex simulation in the first place, arguing that the galaxy needed a standardized measure of tactical excellence. Kethvox's design was his masterpiece, incorporating every known form of warfare, political maneuvering, and resource management into a single, impossibly intricate scenario. This human, Kethvox had told his assistant, his forearms gesturing in agitation, has no formal training in advanced tactical theory. Her educational background includes basic flight training and something called practical asteroid navigation. How can someone with such limited intellectual preparation possibly comprehend the simulation's strategic depth? His assistant, a younger Nexari named Velkoth, had consulted the human's file with typical Nexari thoroughness. Perhaps, Overlord, this presents an opportunity to gather data on how less sophisticated minds approach complex tactical problems. The failure patterns might prove illuminating. Kethvox had settled his chromatophores into a pattern indicating grudging agreement. Yes, I suppose there is scientific value in observing such a fundamental mismatch between challenge and capability. Document everything. This may be the most comprehensive example of cognitive overreach we've recorded. Back on Terra, Holland herself was blissfully unaware of the diplomatic crisis her upcoming simulation attempt was causing. She'd received the notification while finishing a cargo run to Kepler Station, 6 months' worth of medical supplies and entertainment modules for a mining colony that barely qualified as habitable. Her reaction to being selected for the Apex simulation had been characteristically understated. "Huh?" she'd said, reading the message while eating a particularly questionable sandwich from the station's food court. "That's weird." Her approach to preparation was similarly casual. While other species would have assembled teams of advisors, studied historical tactical scenarios, and spent months in strategic meditation, Holland had checked out a few tactical manuals from the base library and skimmed them during hyperspace jumps. Her methodology was less intensive strategic study and more light bedtime reading between episodes of vintage Earth entertainment programs. The night before her scheduled simulation attempt, Holland had video-called her younger brother Jake, a civilian engineer working on terraforming projects in the outer colonies. "So you're really doing this thing?" Jake had asked, his face pixelating slightly due to the subspace communication delay. Apparently, Holland had shrugged. Can't be worse than trying to land a cargo hauler in a thunderstorm on Minerva 2. Brooke, this is the thing that no one has ever beaten. Like, ever. Species with brains the size of small starships have tried and failed. Yeah, I saw that in the briefing materials. Seems like they're all trying really hard to make it complicated. Jake had paused, studying his sister's face through the grainy connection. You realize the entire galaxy is basically waiting to watch you crash and burn, right? Holland had grinned, that particular expression that their parents had learned to associate with expensive property damage. Well, then I guess we'll give them a show. The morning of the simulation, Holland had arrived at the testing facility exactly on time, which surprised everyone who'd read her file. She'd even managed to find a clean uniform, though the boots were still scuffed and her hair looked like she'd styled it with a hyperdrive engine. Kane had met her at the entrance, looking like a man who'd spent the night practicing his resignation speech. Holland, he'd said carefully, I want you to understand that no one expects you to actually complete this simulation. The important thing is to represent humanity with dignity and— Boss, Holland had interrupted gently. I've read the manual. I know what I'm walking into. Do you, though? Kane had asked, genuine concern in his voice. Because this isn't like threading an asteroid field or outrunning customs patrol. This is cognitive warfare at the highest level. Multidimensional thinking that would challenge a quantum computer. Holland had nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, I got that impression from the technical specifications. Seems like whoever designed it really wanted to make sure everyone knew how smart they were. Kane had blinked, unsure whether that was insight or insubordination. With Holland, the line between the two was often razor-thin. As they'd walked toward the simulation chamber, Holland had seemed remarkably relaxed for someone about to attempt the impossible. She'd waved casually to a few technicians she recognized from previous assignments, complimented someone on their new haircut, and generally acted like she was heading to a routine training exercise rather than galactic humiliation. Any last-minute questions? Kane had asked as they reached the chamber entrance. Just one, Holland had said. If I break this thing, do I have to pay for it? The Galactic Apex simulation began the way most cosmic disasters do, with someone pressing a button and immediately regretting it. As the holographic displays materialized around Holland, the gallery fell silent, except for the occasional whisper of beings placing last-minute side bets on exactly how quickly she'd fail. The scenario that loaded was designated Convergence Crisis Gamma 9, a delightfully cheerful situation involving 3 separate wars, a collapsing trade federation, political revolution on 6 different worlds, and resource shortages that would make a Ferengi economist weep. Here's what the simulation presented to our intrepid commander. Holland found herself commanding a small battle group caught between 2 much larger hostile fleets, while simultaneously trying to evacuate civilians from a planet experiencing ecological collapse. Oh, and she had to negotiate a ceasefire with species that had been trying to exterminate each other for 3 centuries, manage supply lines that were being attacked by pirates, and somehow convince a group of isolationist colonies to provide humanitarian aid to their sworn enemies. Simple Tuesday morning stuff, really. The standard approach, developed over decades of failures, was to prioritize objectives based on strategic value, establish secure communication channels with all parties, and begin the delicate process of multi-party negotiation while maintaining defensive positions. Most attempters would spend the first 20 minutes just trying to understand all the variables at play. Holland looked at the tactical display for approximately 6 seconds, cracked her knuckles again, and did something that made every military observer in the gallery question their understanding of strategic doctrine. She ignored the entire scenario. Instead of engaging with the elaborate political crisis or the carefully balanced military situation, Holland immediately began poking around in the simulation's peripheral systems. While holographic fleets were positioning for battle and digital diplomats were preparing for crucial negotiations, she was accessing maintenance logs, checking communication relay efficiency ratings, and examining what appeared to be background environmental data. "What is she doing?" Ambassador Velthari asked, their chromatophores shifting to confused purple. General Kane, watching from the gallery, felt his left eye begin to twitch. "I honestly have no idea. That's not even part of the simulation." In the control booth, Overlord Kethvox was experiencing what his species called logical vertigo, the disorienting sensation that occurred when observed behavior deviated so far from predicted patterns that their analytical frameworks began to collapse. "She's not engaging with any of the primary scenario elements," Kethvox muttered to his assistant. "She's examining infrastructure data that most participants never even notice exists." "Perhaps," Velkoth suggested carefully, "she doesn't understand what she's supposed to be doing." Down in the simulation chamber, Holland was having what could generously be called a conversation with the tactical computer. If conversations typically involved one party completely ignoring what the other was saying. "Okay," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "So, we've got 3 separate conflicts, but they're all using the same communication relay network. That's interesting." She pulled up a star chart and began highlighting connection points between systems. "And the environmental collapse on Caridian Prime is being caused by mining operations that are supplying materials to—" "Oh, that's cute. They're supplying both sides of the war." The holographic battle fleets, meanwhile, were still positioning for engagement, waiting for Holland to give them orders. The digital diplomats were standing by for her to initiate contact. The entire elaborate scenario was poised for her to begin the complex dance of multidimensional strategy that had challenged the galaxy's finest minds. Instead, she opened a communication channel to what appeared to be a commercial shipping database. "Commander Holland," the simulation's AI prompted politely, "you have 17 minutes before the first engagement begins. Would you like to review the tactical situation?" "Nah, I'm good," Holland replied, now cross-referencing mining schedules with fleet movement patterns. "Though I do have a question about these shipping manifests. Are these updated in real time, or are they working off cached data?" The AI paused, actually paused, like it needed a moment to process the question. The commercial shipping data reflects current simulation parameters." "Yes." "Great," Holland said cheerfully, and began typing commands that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. In the gallery, beings were starting to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't going according to script. Failed attempts usually followed predictable patterns, overconfidence followed by growing confusion, desperate attempts to salvage the situation, and finally, dignified surrender. This was something else entirely. Holland had now been in the simulation for 90 seconds and hadn't issued a single military order. Is she hacking the supply chain?" asked General Thexari, leaning forward in his seat. "She can't be," Velthari replied, but their chromatophores were now cycling through uncertain orange. "That's not part of the tactical scenario. The simulation doesn't even track those systems in detail." That's when Holland did something that made every programmer in the control booth simultaneously reach for their emergency shutdown protocols. She started editing the simulation's economic models, not breaking them, not exploiting obvious loopholes, but actually rewriting the underlying resource allocation algorithms while the simulation was running. It was like performing surgery on yourself while running a marathon. Theoretically possible, practically insane, and definitely not covered in the instruction manual. "That's not supposed to be possible," Kethvok said, his forearms now gesturing in what his species considered barely controlled panic. "The economic systems are background processes. They're not meant to be directly accessible to participants." "Apparently," Velkoth observed with typical Nexari understatement, "the human disagrees with that assessment." Down in the chamber, Holland was having the time of her life. She'd discovered that the simulation's economic models were surprisingly sophisticated, but also surprisingly brittle. Change a few key variables, shipping schedules here, resource pricing there, a subtle adjustment to trade route efficiency, and suddenly the entire foundation of the conflict scenario began to shift. "Oh, this is interesting," she muttered, pulling up a cascading series of economic projections. "If I just adjust the market price of trilithium by about 12%, and redirect these 3 shipping routes to bypass the conflict zones." The first sign that something was going seriously wrong, or right, depending on your perspective, came when the holographic fleets began receiving new orders. Not from Holland, but from their own economic command structures, which were suddenly finding the entire war too expensive to justify. "Wait," said Admiral Kolethvar, the Corvin military advisor watching from the gallery. "Are the fleets withdrawing? Why are they withdrawing?" In the simulation, the Hegemony fleet had just received updated cost projections showing that continued military action would result in economic losses exceeding the strategic value of their objectives by roughly 300%. The opposing syndicate fleet was getting similar reports. Both sides began what could only be described as the galaxy's most expensive game of you first. But Holland wasn't done. While the fleets were busy trying to figure out why war had suddenly become unprofitable, she'd moved on to the ecological crisis on Caridian Prime. Instead of organizing evacuations or negotiating aid packages, she'd simply fixed it. How did she stop the environmental collapse? Belthari demanded, their entire body now cycling through agitated color patterns. In the control booth, technicians were frantically checking system logs. She adjusted the mining extraction schedules to match planetary regeneration cycles, one reported, and rerouted industrial waste processing through natural ecosystem filters. The environmental damage is now reversing itself automatically. "That's not a tactical solution," Kethvox protested. That's just practical problem-solving." "Yeah," Holland called out from the chamber, apparently having heard him through the intercom. "Wild concept, right?" By now, the simulation had been running for 3 minutes and 22 seconds, and Holland had essentially turned the entire scenario inside out. The wars were ending due to economic factors. The environmental crisis was resolving itself, and the civilian evacuation was no longer necessary because there was nothing to evacuate from. But she still wasn't done. The final piece of Holland's incomprehensible strategy involved the political revolution on 6 different worlds. This was perhaps the most complex part of the original scenario, a web of competing ideologies, historical grievances, and cultural misunderstandings that would challenge a team of diplomatic specialists. Holland solved it by giving everyone what they actually wanted, instead of what they said they wanted. The revolutionaries on Altair 6 aren't actually fighting for political ideology, she explained to the increasingly horrified gallery. They're fighting because the current government controls the water distribution networks, and they're charging extortion-level rates, so I just opened the networks to competitive bidding. Problem solved. And the civil war on Rigel 3? Velthari asked weakly. Oh, that's just a family dispute that got out of hand. I scheduled them all for mediation next Tuesday. Sent them a calendar invite and everything. The simulation's AI, now completely out of its depth, made one last attempt to maintain some semblance of the original scenario. Commander Holland, you still have hostile pirate fleets threatening the supply lines. Do I? Holland asked, pulling up the shipping manifests again. Because, according to these logs, those pirates are actually legitimate salvage operators who've been misclassified due to a clerical error in the registration database. I just updated their status. They're now providing escort services for the humanitarian aid shipments. The silence in the gallery was deafening. Hundreds of beings from across the galaxy sat in stunned contemplation of what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't tactical brilliance in any recognizable form. This wasn't strategic thinking as they understood it. This was something else entirely. A complete rejection of the fundamental assumptions that the entire scenario was built on. Simulation complete, the AI announced in what sounded like electronic bewilderment. All primary objectives achieved. All secondary objectives achieved. All tertiary objectives also achieved. Total time elapsed. 38 seconds. Wait, 38 seconds? That couldn't be right. The control booth frantically checked their chronometers. Sure enough, while it had felt like much longer, Holland had actually completed her incomprehensible solution in just over half a minute. In the chamber, Holland stretched and looked up at the gallery like she'd just finished a routine maintenance check. So, she called out, how'd I do? The answer to that question would trigger the most significant diplomatic crisis in hegemony history. But that's a story for Part 4. For now, all anyone could do was stare at the tactical displays showing a completely resolved scenario and try to process the fact that a human cargo pilot had just made the galaxy's most challenging simulation look like a homework assignment. I think, General Kane said quietly, I'm going to need a very large drink. In the control booth, Overlord Kethvox was staring at his life's work, with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that their supposedly impregnable fortress had a door marked Exit that nobody had ever bothered to try. 38 seconds, he repeated numbly. She did it in 38 seconds. Should we run a diagnostic? Velkoth suggested hesitantly. Oh, we're going to run every diagnostic we have, Kethvox replied. And then we're going to run some that don't exist yet. Because if this simulation can be solved in 38 seconds, then either she's the most brilliant tactical mind in galactic history, or— He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the control booth knew what he was thinking. The alternative was that the galactic apex simulation, the pinnacle of strategic challenge, the test that had humbled the greatest minds in the galaxy for nearly 4 decades, had a flaw so fundamental that only someone completely unfamiliar with proper tactical thinking would notice it. And judging by Holland's casual wave to the gallery as she headed for the exit, she was already thinking about lunch. The silence that followed Holland's casual exit from the simulation chamber was the kind of silence you get when the universe suddenly stops making sense and everyone needs a moment to recalibrate their understanding of reality. It lasted approximately 15 seconds, which in galactic diplomatic terms is roughly equivalent to a geological age. Then all hell broke loose. Impossible! Overlord Kethvox's voice cracked across the gallery's intercom system. Run the diagnostic protocols. All of them. Check every system, every algorithm, every single line of code. Ambassador Velthari was on their feet, chromatophores cycling through what could only be described as diplomatic fury. A spectacular light show of oranges and reds that would have been beautiful if it wasn't signaling an impending interstellar incident. "This is unacceptable," Velthari declared, their voice carrying the kind of authority that came from representing 17 different star systems and having the ego to match. "The human clearly violated the simulation parameters. No one solves the apex in 38 seconds. No one." General Thexari was frantically consulting his tactical manual, as if somewhere in its 1,000 pages there might be an explanation for what he'd just witnessed. "She didn't even engage in combat. She completely ignored standard strategic doctrine. This can't be considered a legitimate completion." From his position in the gallery, General Kane watched the chaos unfold with the weary resignation of a man who'd spent too many years dealing with Holland's particular brand of problem-solving. Part of him wasn't even surprised. This was exactly the kind of nonsensical success that seemed to follow her around like a particularly persistent comet. Down in the control booth, technicians were running diagnostics with the desperate energy of people who'd just watched their entire professional worldview collapse. Streams of data flowed across holographic displays, system analyses cascaded through quantum processors, and error reports piled up like digital snowdrifts. "All systems nominal," reported Chief Technician Vextar, a Zephyrian whose 6 arms allowed him to operate multiple diagnostic interfaces simultaneously. "No system breaches, no unauthorized access to restricted protocols, no violations of simulation parameters." "Then explain how she completed a scenario designed to be unsolvable," Kethvox demanded, his 4 arms gesturing in patterns that would have been considered obscene in polite Nexari society. "Well," Vextar said carefully, "technically, the scenario isn't designed to be unsolvable. It's designed to be extremely difficult. The humans simply found a solution path that our models didn't anticipate." The word "technically" hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, because technically was the most dangerous word in any language when it came to exposing the gap between what something was supposed to do and what it actually did. Meanwhile, Holland herself had wandered over to the facility's cafeteria, blissfully unaware that her casual problem-solving had just triggered what would later be known as the 38th second crisis. She was examining the day's lunch options with the same methodical approach she'd applied to the eye simulation when General Kane found her. "Holland," Kane said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of a man trying not to make any sudden gestures that might make the situation worse. "We need to talk." "Sure thing, boss," Holland replied, poking suspiciously at what the menu claimed was Rigelian protein synthesis in traditional Earth-style preparation. "You think this is actual chicken? Or are they just calling it that to make us feel better?" "Holland, you just completed the Apex simulation." "Yeah, I got that impression from all the shouting in the gallery. Did I miss something important? Because honestly, that seemed pretty straightforward once you figured out what was actually going on." Kane stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the casual tone with which she'd just dismissed the galaxy's most challenging tactical scenario. "Straightforward? Well, yeah. I mean, once you realize that the whole thing is basically a really complicated way of testing whether people can think outside their own assumptions, it's not that hard." Holland had apparently decided the alleged chicken was worth the risk and was now adding what she hoped was some kind of sauce. "The problem is that everyone keeps trying to solve it like it's a tactical simulation when it's really more like a systems analysis problem." "A systems analysis problem?" "Right. See, whoever designed this thing, that Nexari guy, right? He built it like a tactical scenario because that's how his brain works. Everything neat and organized, with proper strategic principles and logical decision trees. But real problems aren't usually like that. Real problems are messy and connected to other problems, and half the time the thing you think is the problem isn't actually the problem at all. Kane felt something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or possibly just a stress-induced migraine. So what? You ignored the tactical scenario? I didn't ignore it. I just looked at why it existed in the first place. Holland took a cautious bite of the maybe chicken and made a face that suggested her optimism had been misplaced. Like, take those 3 wars. Everyone assumes you have to pick sides, negotiate truces, manage military assets. But why are they fighting? What do they actually want? Turns out, mostly they want things that they can get, without shooting each other if you just arrange things differently. Back in the simulation facility, the diplomatic crisis was escalating with the kind of exponential intensity that made interstellar relations such a fascinating field of study. Ambassador Velthari had been joined by representatives from 6 other species, all demanding explanations, investigations, and in some cases, formal apologies for the disruption of what they considered a sacred institution. The integrity of the Apex simulation is fundamental to the hegemony's military assessment protocols, declared Ambassador Quextull of the Zephyrian Collective, her 6 arms weaving through the air in patterns of barely contained indignation. If any species can simply bypass the established parameters, then the entire system becomes meaningless. Overlord Kethvox, meanwhile, was having what his species would politely term a philosophical crisis. The simulation represented 15 years of his life, the culmination of his strategic thinking, his contribution to galactic civilization. And a human cargo pilot had just made it look like a children's puzzle. "Run the analysis again," he ordered his assistants. "There has to be something we missed. Some flaw in her approach, some violation of protocol, something that invalidates her completion." But the more they analyzed Holland's solution, the more horrifying the truth became. She hadn't cheated. She hadn't violated any rules. She had simply approached the problem from an angle that none of them had ever considered. "Overlord," Velkoth said hesitantly, "I think we need to consider the possibility that our fundamental assumptions about the simulation may have been incomplete." "Incomplete how?" "Well, we designed it to test tactical thinking within established strategic frameworks. But the human didn't use established strategic frameworks. She treated it as a practical problem to be solved, rather than a strategic challenge to be overcome." Kethvox's chromatophores shifted to patterns indicating deep philosophical distress. "Are you suggesting that our most sophisticated tactical assessment tool has been missing the point?" "I'm suggesting," Velkoth replied carefully, "that maybe there's more than one way to be intelligent." This was, in Nexari culture, roughly equivalent to suggesting that mathematics might be optional, a statement so fundamentally challenging to their worldview that it required careful consideration before being dismissed as obvious insanity. Back in the cafeteria, Holland had given up on the alleged chicken, and was now explaining her approach to an increasingly bewildered General Kane. "The thing is," she continued, "everyone who attempts this simulation is already trapped by the same basic assumption, that it's a military problem that requires military solutions. But most conflicts aren't really military problems. They're economic problems, or resource problems, or communication problems that look like military problems, because that's the only framework people know how to use. So you just fixed the underlying problems?" "Pretty much. It's like if someone gives you a locked door and asks you to figure out the combination, but then you notice the door isn't actually attached to anything and you can just walk around it. Everyone's so focused on the lock that they don't see the bigger picture. Kane was quiet for a moment, processing this explanation. Holland, do you realize what you've done? This simulation has been the galaxy's standard for tactical excellence for almost 40 years. Thousands of beings have failed it. And you're telling me it was basically a trick question? Holland shrugged. I mean, I wouldn't call it a trick question. More like, everyone was so impressed by how complicated it was that they forgot to ask whether complicated was actually necessary. That's when Kane's communication device chimed with an urgent message from Hegemony Command. He read it, blinked, read it again, and then looked at Holland with an expression of mixed horror and admiration. "They want to interview you," he said. "Who wants to interview me?" "Everyone. The Hegemony Council, the Strategic Analysis Board, the Academy of Tactical Sciences, 3 different news networks, and something called the Institute for the Study of Non-Standard Problem Resolution, which I'm pretty sure they just made up 5 minutes ago." Holland looked genuinely puzzled. "Why? I just solved a puzzle. It's not like I invented faster-than-light travel or cured the common cold." "Holland," Kane said gently, "you didn't just solve a puzzle. You made the galaxy's smartest beings look like they've been overthinking everything for the past 4 decades. Do you have any idea what kind of existential crisis that creates?" Back in the simulation facility, the existential crisis was in full swing. Overlord Kethvox had locked himself in his office and was systematically reviewing every decision he'd made in designing the simulation. Ambassador Velthari was composing what would later be known as the Formal Complaint Regarding Unprecedented Tactical Methodology, a diplomatic document so strongly worded it would require 3 different translations just to be safely read aloud. But perhaps the most interesting reaction came from the younger beings in the gallery. Junior officers, diplomatic attachés, and technical staff who hadn't yet invested decades of their careers in the assumption that complex problems required complex solutions. "You know," said Lieutenant Torres, Kane's aide, to a group of his peers, "when you think about it, what she did makes perfect sense. We've all been so busy trying to prove we're smart enough to solve an impossible problem that we never questioned whether the problem needed to be impossible in the first place." This observation would later be credited as the beginning of what historians would call the Holland Doctrine, the radical idea that sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is to change the problem rather than find a more complex solution. 3 hours after Holland's simulation attempt, Hegemony Command issued a statement that was a masterpiece of diplomatic non-commitment. The recent completion of the Apex simulation by Commander Holland represents an unprecedented approach to tactical problem-solving that will require extensive analysis before conclusions can be drawn regarding its implications for strategic assessment protocols. Translation: We have no idea what just happened, but we're pretty sure it changes everything. Holland, meanwhile, had finished her questionable lunch and was heading back to her quarters, planning to catch up on some reading before her next cargo run. As far as she was concerned, she'd solved a puzzle, answered some questions, and now it was time to get back to work. "Hey, boss," she called to Kane as they walked through the facility corridors. "Am I still scheduled for that supply run to the Outer Rim colonies next week?" Kane looked at her with the expression of a man who'd just realized that his understanding of the universe had fundamentally shifted. "Holland, I don't think you're going to be flying cargo runs for much longer." "Why not?" "I like cargo runs. They're simple, straightforward, and nobody expects you to revolutionize galactic strategic thinking while you're doing them." And there, in that casual observation, was perhaps the most profound truth of all. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply treat complicated problems like simple ones and see what happens. The galaxy would spend the next several years figuring out what, exactly, had happened when Brooke Holland walked into the Apex simulation and casually dismantled 40 years of strategic orthodoxy in 38 seconds. But that's a story for another day. For now, all anyone could do was watch a human cargo pilot walk away from the most significant tactical achievement in galactic history, already thinking about her next routine assignment, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they'd been making everything much harder than it needed to be.